Hi there. Uh,
I,
Welcome to the Globe Docs Film Festival. I'm Mark Shanahan. I'm a living arts writer here at the Boston Globe. And we're talking for a bit with English filmmaker Nick Broomfield, who directed the movie you just watched, The Stones and Brian Jones. You may also know Nick from some of his other films, Monster in a Box, Heidi Fleiss, Hollywood Madam, Furt and Courtney, and Biggie and Tupac. So I just want to say hello to Nick and thank him for coming on with us. Hello, Nick.
Hello, great pleasure to be here.
Well, we appreciate it very much. Can we just start by, or can I just start by asking you to talk to us a little bit about why you've made a movie about the unsung, I guess I would say unsung, Brian Jones, and why now?
Well, I think I've been sort of looking more and more at that part of my life that formed me. I just previously made a film about my father and looking very much at the 60s and the 50s. And one of the things I remember most in the 60s was bumping into Brian Jones when I was returning to my boarding school. I went to this very, typical British boarding school way out in the country, rather strict. And the Stones embodied a freedom that we all wished we had. And it was kind of like a miracle. I was on this train, and in those days they had corridors, and the first class compartments were all off the corridor. And there was Brian Jones sitting all by himself on the train. And I sort of went in, and he was so kind and, very sweet and talkative. And it was a sort of seminal moment, really. And then he obviously, I guess I spent a lot of time wondering what really had happened to him, because at that time, this was 6 years before he died, he seemed to have absolutely everything going for him. He was probably the most popular person in the band. He had all the girls, all the fan mail. He was the leader of the band. And he just seemed a very charming person. 6 years later, he was, found drowned at the bottom of his pool in very bad shape. He had been thrown out of the band. And I'd always, it was just one of those conundrums that had stayed with me.
Yeah.
And so I went back into the film to try and work out what his contribution had been and who he was and where he'd come from, and to try and get a little understanding of what happened.
That's terrific. I guess, that I suspect that many people, even some who consider themselves Stones fans, are going to learn something from this film. And I think, for instance, that, people may not realize how much the Rolling Stones were Brian Jones's band, and how much his guitar style defined and influenced the band's early sound. Was that something that you sort of set out to, I don't know, I'm sure that you know that, but I guess that, was that something that interested you in
Yeah, I didn't know a fantastic amount before. I think it's always good to approach a film with a pretty open mind without thinking I'm going to do this, that, or the other. And what struck me, especially speaking to Bill Wyman at length, was that, Brian was the most musically accomplished at the beginning there. He had probably played it in 100 gigs before. He was the one who managed to work out the slide guitar, how the slide guitar really worked, and he could play it fluently. And he was the sort of musicologist who knew what, what keys, say, Muddy Waters was playing in. Everyone played in different keys. And he taught Keith Richards the sort of interlacing that the Stones are so famous for. So I think he made a very real contribution at the beginning for the first maybe year or year and a half. He used to do all the bookings of the band's gigs, and he handled the money, and he was very much like the leader of the band. He answered most of the letters. He made all the bookings, and it then changed, and I think he had a real problem not being the leader of the band and getting into a kind of rivalry with Mick and Keith, who had taken over because they were such skilled songwriters, which was a discipline that Brian didn't have.
Right. You mentioned the letters, and there's so much in the film that is feels, at least to casual fan such as myself, new to see those letters and to to get that kind of insight into Brian and his response to his really quite thoughtful response to fans. Can you just talk about your process of finding that stuff? Not only the letters, but some of the footage, some of the family stuff.
Well, I think what we set out to do was to not use all the footage that had been seen before, and nearly all the footage that's in the film is unseen footage. And I had 3 archivists working on it for 2.5 years to come up with that footage. And it was quite difficult because, people weren't filming, obviously, so much in the 60s. And we made so many trips out to people's lockups, where they were sure they had great footage, and it turned out to be either rotten in the can or some strange home movies that we couldn't use at all. But of course, we did come up with some gold and incredible footage that hadn't really seen the light of day, that was very revealing of the band, of just how young they all were and how naive, in a sense, they were, because they were the first. This was like untrodden territory that they were going on, and there was a sort of wonderful naivety in the band, and you see that in the letters too that we managed to dig up, where Brian was so concerned that his parents approved of him, like most kids, he wanted his parents to be proud of him, and they really weren't very proud of him. They wanted him to have a professional job, be a barrister or something in the professions. And I think Brian really, really struggled with that. But we wanted to find the footage that really expressed that properly, and we were very, very lucky that we found what we did.
Yeah, it's terrific. And you mentioned the father, that heartbreaking letter at the end, and it's not clear, and I think it's intentionally not clear whether Brian read that. Do we believe that he did read that letter, or do we where the father basically cops to regret about the way the thing went down when Brian was cast out?
I think it was a letter that was unopened.
Right.
And it was found in the attic of Linda Leach's house. She's now actually married to Donovan, but she had one of Brian's children and has remained incredibly loyal and loving to Brian. I only spoke to her yesterday, actually, and she was still so determined that he's recognized for everything he did. And she, of course, reads the letter out in the film. And I think there was just a bunch of stuff that, when Brian was living with her and the family, that was just sort of left behind, or maybe came immediately after he died.
Yeah.
So I think he never really had the reconciliation with his parents that he wanted, which obviously was very, very, very sad, and very sad that his father realized so late that he had sort of brought Brian up in a way that had changed. I think there was such a big gulf between the pre-war generation, which is what his parents were, and the post-war generation, with the way they viewed the world and the kind of lives they wanted to lead.
Yeah. I want to talk about the women, but before we leave that, or before we do that, you mentioned Bill Wyman's participation, which is terrific. Very sweet. Notably absent is are Mick and Keith, at least sort of contemporary Mick and Keith. I mean, they're in the film otherwise. I'm guessing that was their choice.
No, I very purposely didn't involve them in the making of the film. I mean, I know Mick. I have an enormous admiration for him too. I mean, who couldn't? He's probably the greatest survivor of all. But I have a number of friends who've made films with the Stones, and it's rarely had a happy ending. And they've really managed to make the film they wanted to make. And I think, I wanted to have the freedom to tell the story that hasn't been told before. And the reason it hasn't been told before is because the Stones have always controlled all the films that were going to be made about them. So I felt that this was a period of time which I could make without having them all on board, particularly as they had a number of covers that they were doing. So they didn't own and control all the music. And because I think it was a period when they were starting that was much more open. It wasn't so tightly controlled. It was before management moved in and decided this is their image, this is how. And I think it was a much more telling time. And it lent itself to a very free approach.
Interesting. I mean, they didn't attend his funeral, and as the film makes clear, they were the principal songwriters, and that was a skill that Brian didn't have, and he became quite paranoid and insecure about. And I didn't know if that might have some relevance. Can you just talk about, though, that relationship between Mick and Keith and Brian?
Well, I think it's interesting. If you look at the dynamics of the Stones, whoever was friends with Mick, with Keith, who was kind of in the middle, kind of had the power in the band. So there were obviously, I think it started off with Keith learning his guitar work from Brian, and they would just be, as Bill talks, sitting in bed in their coats, working out how to weave the guitars. Yeah. And then I think with the songwriting, there was obviously this incredible partnership between Mick and Keith. And then I think there was a sort of resurgence of a relationship between Brian and Keith. It was partly, I think, to do with Anita, who was playing around with Mick, and it was a real hornet's nest, I think. Yeah. And so I think there was always a real loyalty between Keith and Brian, simply because they'd played together and they'd been through so much together, which probably didn't apply so much to Mick, I think.
Yeah. Brian is not an entirely sympathetic character.
No.
As the movie makes clear, and the children, the number of children with the number of women. I think it's Pat Andrews in the film who is the mother of one of the kids, who has a quite damning assessment. She says that he uses and discards people. And there's that scene in the film where he's tapping out his cigarette ash on Bill Wyman's head. That he was mischievous, and he was unpredictable, and he seemed entirely just undependable in any meaningful way. And yet, the women you just talked about, Linda, they loved him.
Yeah, and so, and Dawn, I think, is still completely in love with him, and was, you know, told me wonderful things about Brian, and then was terribly worried about how that would look in front of her husband, you know, because I think they'd had such a passionate romance together. I think part of it too, and that's why I felt it needed to be a film where the basic story was told by the women in Brian's life, because I think they understood him much better than his fellow bandmates.
Yeah.
You know, normally in these rock and roll films, you have all the male members of the band going on about what it was like to be together. This film is really told very much from the women's point of view. And I think, you know, Brian was like kind of like a lost kid. He had very low self-esteem. I think he loathed himself. And he treated people very badly. And I think part of people who have self-loathing is that they don't treat other people well. It's almost like they lose respect for people who like them.
Yeah.
And I think that made Brian a particularly difficult character.
I just have a couple of more things. One is, you know, the film is very much focused on Brian Jones' life and not his death. But you know that there are lots of theories and thoughts and speculation about, you know, how he ended up in that pool. You are someone who is has in the past shown an interest in investigating such
Right.
theories. Talk to me about. Are you satisfied with the explanation of how he ended up dead, and why? What was the thought about not even addressing that?
Well, I didn't want to sort of open up a can of worms, particularly as I was going to dismiss the theory. But I read all the books. I contacted all the people who were still available. And I spent a lot of time talking with Bill Wyman. Bill Wyman's girlfriend at the time of Brian's death was Ingrid. And Ingrid was very, very close to Anna Wallen, who was with Brian when he died. And Anna came and stayed with Ingrid and Bill immediately afterwards to get away from the press. So for the 3 days after Brian died, Bill was basically locked up in the Hilton at Kensington with Anna Wallen. And Anna Wallen went on and on about how they'd been in the house, and when she came out, Brian was at the bottom of the pool, and she tried to resuscitate him, all that stuff.
Yeah.
10 years later, she wrote a book saying that she suspected murder, and came out with all these conspiracy theories. And Bill said, look, she needed money. There's no other reason for it. I saw her, she was in tears. We were all in tears. She poured her heart out repeatedly over those 3 days. She never mentioned a single thing about that.
Yeah.
And that seemed, I felt that Bill's, explanation, which was that Brian, his high was to be on the verge of sleep and to exist in that twilight zone of sort of semi-nodding out and coming back, and he just did it once too often in a swimming pool. I think he was abusing himself. Apparently, he lived off of a diet of pork pies, which is, as any British person would tell you, not a recipe for a long life.
Yeah.
And just took drugs and just abused himself. And,
right.
I think if it hadn't happened that day, it would have happened shortly thereafter.
Well, and so that leads to my last question, and that is, Keith says in the film that he was unlikely to survive. That many folks, living that lifestyle just don't. And I guess I'm curious to know, what do you suppose? I mean, Brian might have done if he could have somehow straightened himself out. And also, I'm interested to know what you think about, you have that great bit in the film about how, Keith writes the satisfaction riff, and Brian Jones is like, oh God, this is terrible. And I guess I wonder what you think. What would he make of what the Stones are doing these days?
Well, I think part of him, he loved being a rock star, and he loved the adoration and that incredible success. You kind of know he would love that. Who wouldn't? I mean, they're a kind of miracle. They're still going. They're still coming out with amazing music. They're icons for so much, and they've influenced so many people. And I hope that he would at least give himself some pride that he formed the band, and not. I think he spent a lot of time beating himself up, right, and hating himself for not writing the music and lacking the security to believe in his songs and his talent, and abusing the people who liked him, abusing the women around him. And I think it's very sad that he didn't give himself more credit than he did, and he was, and I think it went back probably to the way he was brought up by his folks, which was, he wasn't up to their standards. He didn't perform up to their expectations. And I think it's almost a classic textbook case of that. Right.
Well, you do, I think, Nick, you do give him the credit that he deserves with this film, and I think it's a fitting tribute. I appreciate you. We appreciate you taking some time to talk about the movie, and best of luck with it.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
All right.